Hello and welcome to the second season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by the 1947 Partition Archive, a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of partition. It has documented the life stories of more than 9,700 witnesses to the South Asian partition of 1947. The Oral History Project is the largest of its kind in South Asia, and with passion and dedication, they have made it possible to preserve unique stories in about 750 different cities and villages across 18 countries. Sunday Stories is an event series that will bring to you academics, scholars, oral historians, musicians, artists, and people's personal stories of the partition. Like the name suggests, it will take place every Sunday at the same time, so be sure to tune in. My name is Sonam Kalra. I'm a musician with my own personal interest and body of work on partition. And today I am in conversation with a very special guest, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. He is a researcher, author, and historian with a special interest in environmental history and colonial history of the British and contemporary India. He's a professor of environmental studies and history at the Ashoka University, and he has also taught at the universities of Cornell and Jadavpur and at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bengaluru. Mahesh teaches history and environmental studies at Ashoka University, but he also appears frequently on Indian television as a political analyst. He's also a columnist in the print media, writing on wildlife conservation, political, and environmental issues. In 2010, he chaired the Elephant Task Force, GAJA, of the Indian Ministry of Environment and Forests. The task force was formed to formulate measures for the protection of elephants in India. His first book was called Fencing the Forest, which was published in 1996, and most recently, he also published a book called Nature and Nation in 2015 and co-edited At Nature's Edge in 2018. Professor Rangarajan, thank you so much for being here today on Sunday Stories. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So, Professor, I wanted to ask you, we discuss in most of our Sunday Stories, we discuss a lot about partition, about independence, about pre-independence, post-independence. But we don't actually discuss that much about nature and its impact, or the impact of history on nature and nature on history. Can you tell us how British colonialism impacted South Asia's natural environment, and what were the real major environmental changes that happened during the British era?
I think that's an excellent place to begin because the world as it is was reshaped by very important events in the past. And as you know, British rule began in Bengal in 1760s, and the British exited as late as 1947. So one could give a long list. But if I had to pick one thing and to make it interesting today, one person everyone who's listening to us may have heard of is the boy who never existed, Mowgli. Creature written up by Rudyard Kipling. But few may recall, Rudyard Kipling's Mowgli ended his life with a job. He became a forest guard. And Kipling celebrated the forest department. And he argued that the forest department is as important as the railways. It provides timber, which is used for railway sleepers. And the railways, of course, convey troops who can crush rebellions. And Mowgli, as a forest guard, was going to play a very important role, preventing the goats of villagers from eating the saplings which grow into mighty oaks. So by about 1904 or 5, about 20% of British India, over 600,000 square kilometers, had been taken over as government reserve forest. It's a very major administrative accomplishment, and it would form an inspiration for the US Forest Service. But it also left a deep eyesore on the body politic of India. There were people who were denied access, who were deprived of rights, not only tribal peoples, but many sections of the peasantry. So I think that's just one way in which the British changed India, by taking over large areas of state forest. And as is well known, they were inveterate hunters, and particularly from the late 19th century, there's an orgy of shikar by the princes, by the British. There are huge rewards given out for animals. One of the animals we discuss a lot today, it's a global conservation icon, is the tiger. And we're told there are 2,900 to 3,000 tigers in India. So a century ago, 3,000 tigers were being killed every 2 years for reward. So government actually gave out rewards for killing these animals. So I think it's a period of fundamental reshaping of the human-nature relationship. Just referring here to forests and large wild animals, that would illustrate the point.
So you're saying that prior to the British era, this sort of mass hunting was not happening, and this sort of really created a disruption in the way the traditional Indian lived? Is that what you're saying?
No, there were hunts earlier. If you read about a very interesting ruler,
Exactly.
one of Jahangir, for example, Jahangir shot over 86 lions. He killed over 12,000 deer. But I don't think previous rulers tried to exterminate a species. The English were coming into India with a very particular history. You read a lot nowadays about Scotland and independence. So when the English conquer Scotland, there are these clans, MacDonald, and they give out rewards. So if you brought the head of a MacDonald, grisly as it sounds, you got a certain reward. They also give similar rewards for wolves. So, this idea that animals which attack people are unruly and that they are a animal form of human rebellion is very important. And in central India, which I studied, 200 years ago in 1818, Sagar Narmada, it might interest you to know the reward given for a bandit or a thug. The reward was the same for the head of a lion or a wolf. Now, of course, you had to produce the head to get a reward. But I think this idea of wiping out species is new as state policy.
So that was one of the major changes that happened. But also with the construction that they did, was there much more that was impacted? I mean, whether it was the railways or because they would have been cutting through forests, all of that would have disrupted. Much as we're thankful to them for some of the things they did. But what about that?
Excellently put. You see, from the 1850s, they embark on vast railway construction projects. And these are funded by raising money on the market in the London Stock Exchange. And the rate of return was guaranteed. So one should recall, while they built enormous railway lines in India, not a single railway wagon was actually built in India. But the railways were very crucial. Railways, if you've traveled particularly in North India, the rail line is on a raised place by the riverbed. And that cut off the natural channels by which the floodwaters spread out. And Nehru, in his Discovery of India, points out that the coming of railways and macadamized roads, highways along the river channels of North India changed the way floods happen. Railways were also important in terms of denudation of forest. 1 mile of track required around 1,200 sleepers, and they replaced them every 12 years or so. And railways, therefore, were very, very crucial in terms of transforming India's environment. My supervisor, who I wouldn't normally name, Tapan Raichaudhuri, wrote a book in which he estimated that if you had a train of pack bullocks, prior to the coming of railways, a lot of movement was on pack bullocks. You had these string of bullocks. And he said the amount of material transported by 10,000 bullocks could be carried by one goods train. So I think it also transforms the way agriculture works. So railways was a very major change in India, both in terms of the resources needed, extraction of coal, of timber, and also in terms of agriculture.
And also it would have cut off the water bodies for so many, watering holes for so many animals as well. If you're saying they were built along the railways, the railway tracks were built along the rivers. That would have confused the animals. It would have caused a lot of strife there as well. But tell me, so this is what the British era did in terms of the environmental changes. And then came partition. And what were the environmental consequences of partition, immediate, long term?
Well, one, as you know, at least 10 million people moved in to India from what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh. They had to be settled. And certainly in the Punjab, and I'm referring to Delhi, Punjab, Haryana of today, the settling was a very critical factor because land was consolidated. And these consolidated holdings made possible, no one knew this at the time, around 20 years later, the Green Revolution. But another very large number of people were settled in an area known as the Tarai, which is the low-lying grasslands, which run from western UP right through Nepal and into Assam. And much of the Tarai would now be cleared for the first time in history. If you read accounts of the 1870s, the Tarai was an incredible habitat for the tiger, the Barasingha, till fairly late, the rhinoceros, the hog deer. And one reason it could not be settled, we all know, was malaria. And it's a coincidence. It's in the 1940s that DDT begins to be used extensively, that new anti-malarial medicines came in. There was the availability of guns easily. It was just after the World War, and the government during the World War II and after gave out crop protection guns. So there was this huge clearing of the Tarai. If you went and cleared 160 acres, it will become yours. And I think partition indirectly provided the labor force to clear the Tarai, and it's coincided with a major technological change, both DDT and the anti-malarial medicine.
But also then it harmed the environment, as you said, with DDT, with the waste going into the water. I mean, all the industrialization that would happen post-partition to some degree as well, because so many people have come together and that much more waste material goes into the environment, into the rivers. So all of that would have been fairly harmful long-term as well.
And I think we should be clear that, partition is part of the events worldwide that come at the end of the Second World War. Retreating empires often partition their empires. There's huge population movement. And during the Second World War itself, you see this huge emphasis on grow-more-food campaigns. And as you know, one impact of partition was that the area which had the maximum investment in irrigation, Punjab, that is West Punjab, became part of Pakistan. And this would be a very major reason why within, little more than a decade of partition, you get a very important project in the Punjab, which is the building of the Bhakra and the Nangal dams. And Nehru's speech at Bhakra is often cited because he talked about big dams as the temples of modern India. And sometimes people argue that, he was against small dams. But if you read the speech, it's not saying that. And I think it's particularly important today. He's arguing that this dam, Bhakra, is a temple of modern India. It brings together people of all faiths and languages because it will provide electricity, it will provide water. It was at its time the largest masonry dam in the world. Nobody believed that Indians were capable of building such a dam. And he goes on in the second speech, he made two speeches, to say it is larger and more important than the largest temple, mosque or gurudwara. So the way I would see that speech is, it is a civic, peaceful project of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and others coming together in a province which was marked by bloodshed and suffering. And I think there is a similar impulse behind another very important project in environmental terms. We never think of it, Chandigarh. Le Corbusier is a leading architect of the time. He's brought in. And there's a marvelous line sketch of Corbusier. And it's Corbu is a genius. In one page, he shows the transition from the village to the city. So India is going to build this modern city. And M.S. Randhawa, a very important civil servant, was involved in the planting of trees. So, each row of trees would be of one color. So there were these beautiful city of flowering trees. So I think this idea of a new nation state with the modern dam, the city, is also in a sense a response to partition. And both of these have unintended consequences from the very beginning. Chandigarh is a beautifully designed city, but we know from the very beginning, the work of Madhu Sarin and others, that many people who built Chandigarh ended up living in slums in and around Chandigarh. They're still there. And Bhakra, of course, would displace people, some of whom would not be resettled for very long. And dams have long-term consequences on river hydrology and ecology. So I do think partition spurred this idea of a modern nation. And it's interesting in Chandigarh, Corbo would make a very prominent building, which is the legislature. So the idea that, democracy is also somewhere at the heart of it. So I think it's a very good question you asked on partition, and the idea of the new nation going beyond partition. And here in this case, taming the river is a very interesting notion, and creating this garden city. But these are environmental projects. They're not, we can debate whether they're destructive or constructive.
Yeah, or healing in some way, perhaps, when going by Nehru's speech. But also, can you describe how our natural environment, in a larger sense, has changed in South Asia over the last century? And by that, I mean across the areas that form Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. And is there any common environmental issue that's sort of pressing or worrying for most of South Asia at this point, of these three lands together?
So as you know, the population of undivided India was 300 million. And today, this SAARC region, particularly Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, has 1.8 billion people. So 1 out of 4 people on earth live in South Asia. That's more people than in China. This has also been a place which has seen enormous economic transformation. India's peaceful rise or economic transformation, particularly since 1980s. What would be common? This entire region depends on the monsoon for its rainfall. And the monsoon, as we all know, we learn this in school, don't we? the rain clouds form over the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean, and then they waft over and all of that. But one of the things we now know is that moisture content over the Indian Ocean also depends on the Indian Ocean dipole, various temperature shifts and changes. And because we live on one planet, they depend on El Nino, which is a very important current off the coast of Peru. And I'm sure you've been following in the last 25 years, 30 years. It's not that the amount of rain during the monsoon has declined. So on average in India, places, let's say much of India receives 80 to 110 centimeters of rainfall. But what's happened is the monsoon has become more unpredictable.
Right.
So today, the Times of India has an excellent essay with a scholar from University of Arizona who says the monsoon is getting wetter. But when you read the piece, he says it's getting more unpredictable. So there's a term used by climatologists called extreme events, extreme dry and wet spells. And there's a more serious term called extreme events. So the number of extreme events and extreme events has gone up. And this commonly affects all of monsoon Asia because we are used to high rates of precipitation at a certain time. But I think unpredictability of the climate cycle is a common problem to all. There are many others, of course.
To all three of these, right? I mean,
okay. The other which I would hallmark, because it seems to me we can't look at climate change without looking at biological diversity. And it's very striking that the British Indian Empire, which was about 4 million square kilometers, was very diverse in terms of its species of plants and animals and birds. So I'm sure you know that, India, we like to say it's a country with 22 national languages, 28 states. But another way of looking at it is that it has over 400 species of mammals. It has over 1,000 bird species. And the living space of many of these species has seriously declined. There have been some remarkable recoveries. I think the story of the lion in Gujarat would be one, the rhino in Assam. But on the whole, I think that the exertion of pressure on the natural environment, not just the numbers of people, but you hinted at this, didn't you? The construction of dams, the coming of mines, of townships. It is transforming the ability of this landscape and waterscape to support this myriad forms of life. And many of these life forms have been very important to cultures and religions and civilizations in this area. So you are from the world of music, and much of the music across these countries is about the cycle of the seasons. So the flowering of the palash, flame of the forest, is about spring. A call of the papiha or the lapwing is about the coming of the monsoon. So what would life be without those familiar symbols? It's a serious question.
Yeah. What's really interesting to me is that I was reading some of the articles that you forwarded me, and it's interesting that how much we talk of the histories of environment and how they impact socio-political histories. How a particular war would have been stopped because there were floods, or we don't discuss that enough. So would you share some of the impact of socio-political histories on nature and the impact of nature on history as well?
Okay. Well, one of the very well-known events in the 17th century is the battle for the succession around the time of the capture, the imprisonment and death of Shah Jahan. And, of course, Aurangzeb won the battle. There's lots of theories on who won and why. But what is not widely realized, that that period of the 1650s, 60s was part of a larger 17th century crisis of an extreme dry spell in many regions. And 8 years, the monsoon failed. Now, in the 20th century, the monsoon in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh has failed twice, only 3 times. So double failure 1, 2, has happened only thrice. In the 17th century, it was a very serious matter. It was largely agrarian society. And this had a negative effect. Therefore, a lot of people couldn't get enough to eat. And they joined up one of the 3 or 4 armies. So the numbers in armies swell when the crops fail repeatedly. The other is a positive effect, which is that rulers responded, interestingly, with soup kitchens, by distributing food, by writing off tax demands. So nature definitely is very significant in that sense. There's a second way in which I think it's been important in the 20th century. I think in the late 20th century, particularly from the 1930s, one could give the 20s, the building of the Great Hoover Dam on the Colorado. Many countries saw the coming of big dams as a symbol of modernity. India was no exception. Pakistan was no exception. Nepal is no exception. So it's interesting when you look at big dams built all over the world. There are, I think, almost 200 nation states. If you look at the top 5 dam builders, India is prominent among them. And these dams were important for electricity, they were important for irrigation, for flood control, but they had other unintended effects. One was to completely transform the ecology of rivers. The other, in many cases, was to displace very large numbers of people. And so the environmental dilemma in a developing country, certainly in South Asia, is not only about living with other species, it's also how people live with each other, both in times of war and in times of peace. And maybe we need to rethink our definition of peace. Peace is not only the absence of wars between states or brotherhood and sisterhood between humans. What about a peace with nature? And
Yeah.
has this notion of development implicitly built in the idea of the conquest of nature? Is nature capable of conquest? And if it isn't, are we coming to grips with that idea?
Well, that's beautifully put. Is nature capable of conquest? I think just the idea of trying to conquer nature, as you said, is so, in some ways, so ludicrous and so. I mean, it's a force that's so much greater than us. But I think COVID has made so many of us realize that it's not possible, and so many of these natural, I mean, tsunamis, so many things happen, and you realize that it's not possible. But speaking of nature, the thing that often comes to my mind, and we speak of nature, we speak of borders, we speak of histories, is the impact of borders or man-made borders on animals. When I think often of when partition happened, what would have happened to animals who were used to crossing, what continues to happen in elephant corridors when there are natural disasters, when there are borders that are built. And since you've been working so closely with the Elephant Task Force, would you explain to us what really goes on, what really happens, and the traumas that these elephants go through? I read I think there was the Bangladesh border, there was a female elephant that was electrocuted. I mean, some of these are just heart-wrenching stories that borders create. So if you would just share with us.
So, one of the ideas of conservation in the 20th century is that you have an area earmarked for nature, a nature reserve, a national park. And, it's the nice copybook story. The animals and birds are protected and you can go there and look at them. Now, of course, they don't know where the borders end. And one of the things the Elephant Task Force emphasized is that the elephant reserves in India, a very large area of them, is not in the protected areas. And the strategy to follow in these areas is not to remove the elephants or to remove the people, but to try and work out how there can be cohabitation. This is very difficult. Roughly at the time of our report in 2010, about 100 elephants were killed by people every year. Now, it's very sad to say this. The Asian elephant, largest numbers are in India. The male has tusks, the female doesn't. And in some populations in southern India, by then, 2010, not changed now, many of the males have been already killed by ivory poachers. The ratio of male to female in some populations is 1 to 100. But the bulk of the killing of that 100 is not by poachers. It's by farmers, cultivators, laborers who are defending their crops, because the animals often come in and feed on the fields. Now you can imagine one elephant or two or a group walking through a field of ragi or of rice and the impact they would have. And the reverse of that is important. 400 people a year were killed by elephants then, and 600 are killed now. Now the elephants are not killing them because they're going to eat them. They're not carnivores. They're killing them out of fear, or they're killing them to defend their young. So what we argued is that we need a system to see both of these as victims. The people killed by elephants are victims. The elephants are also victims. And here there is something very significant, which is that it is possible. There's a very fine historian, Thomas Troutman, who wrote about this. He wrote a wonderful book called Elephants and Kings. And he argued that from around the 6th century BCE, elephants became such an important strategic resource for kings in parts of South Asia that they started protecting not only the elephant, but the forests in which it lived. He identified 9 elephant forests, or hastavanas. And it may interest you to know the most westernmost of them was in Gujarat. And these elephants, according to these sources, were smaller and more ferocious than the other elephants. But this tradition of protection of elephants as a strategic resource spreads from South into Southeast Asia. It doesn't include China. So with the elephant, it's quite interesting. There has been cooperation between India and Bangladesh, also much more between India and Bhutan. So the Manas Reserve, for example, spans the borders of Bhutan and India. But elephants also cross state borders.
Right.
Chittoor district in South India is very well known because of the very famous Tirupati temple. Around 15 years ago, a group of elephants landed up over there. There have never been elephants there for decades. And initially, they were welcomed. After some time, they started doing crop raiding. So this is a very difficult question. Here is an animal which you revere as a living deity. And you will read one of these elephants electrocuted, people get together, they hold a mourning ceremony, they even gather money and they either bury it or cremate it as. But the reverse, the same people when the elephant raids their crop and does it repeatedly, naturally are not happy. So this is a very critical issue. How do you live with large animals in an agricultural country where there are smallholders? And one answer is we need better forms of crop insurance, we need regular recompense of money, and the routes on which these animals travel need to be open. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of elephants on highways, and people ask, why is the elephant on the highway? No, it's very interesting. Wherever there are hills and there are elephant paths, the highways are on the elephant path. The elephants have carved that path out over centuries. So it's not the elephant which has come on the highway. The highway has been built on the elephant path.
On the elephant path, right.
But I think there is a lot of scope here that there are remarkable cases of cohabitation, coexistence, but it needs very serious intervention both for the animal and its security and habitat and also for the people.
Do you believe enough is being done? I mean,
there is nowhere near enough being done. There is nowhere near enough being done. We are doing a lot. It must be stated, India is a remarkable country. It is on the brink of reintroducing the cheetah. 3 of the very important crocodile species have been saved from extinction. One of them, the gavial, is a triassic creature. I was just joking with one of the organizers that nowadays children all over the world, even very small boys and girls, know T-Rex. I have no recollection of T-Rex because Jurassic Park. Well, you can't T-Rex, but the gavial lived when T-Rex did. But I think there is not enough being done on 2 counts. One is that some of the very important landscapes and waterscapes are being opened up for development despite being listed as critical areas. So if you have a dam being built in the heart of a tiger reserve, you have mangroves, which are an endangered ecosystem being opened up for an airport. Surely we can find a better way and place to do that. The second, which is even more serious, is an astonishing number of people in South Asia depends directly on nature for a living. So if you look at the coast, there are some 8 million fishers, men and women. If you look at inland waters, there are 15 million people, men and women. And so the conservation of these resources here is a matter of livelihood. It's not simply about the aesthetic. So how do we do that? And at times one wishes more were done and were done better and done right.
Right. And you also mentioned when we were speaking earlier about peace among people and peace among nature being related. And you talked of the ethical conduct with other beings. And I think that if you would just elaborate on that, that would just take this forward as well, what we've just spoken about, trying to find, a way for both to coexist.
So the university I have been in for the last few years working, Ashoka, my colleague, Professor Nanjo Tahiri, has written the best biography of Ashoka, doing a fresh study of inscriptions. Incidentally, it might horrify you to know, I was quite shocked. Ashoka, they actually found a statue of him around 15 years ago. And he looks like a very chubby little boy. That's not what you think kings look like. Now, the Ashokan edicts are very remarkable because he proclaimed after the war of Culling that he would not engage in war. Though he became Buddhist, he patronized all faiths. He even patronized the Atavikas, who were known as atheists. What the edicts have also is a lot about human compassion to animals. There's a list of 11 species which were not to be hunted. One of them was the rhinoceros. Obviously, he didn't succeed in that. The other was injunctions against burning of forests, the needless slaughter of animals in the royal kitchen. And students often have asked me, why was he so bothered about this? In the 3rd century BC, there were very few people in this landscape. There were vast forests and grasslands. There must have been huge amounts of animals roaming around. And one answer is that for Ashoka, ethical conduct with other living beings was as important as ethical conduct with human beings. So the notion of compassion, the notion of justice, the notion of equality, just as we think different faiths, cultures, nations have the right to live in peace, just as we think of justice among people, what happens if you think of justice for future generations of people? Should they have the right, to see an elephant, to know what a pollinating bee looks like? And what about justice for other species? So if we think of a notion, now I'm not suggesting Anopheles mosquitoes or the COVID virus should be protected. Absolutely not. Where human life is in danger, we don't do that.
Of course.
But
Of course.
as an ethic, I think the ethical imperative is very crucial. And this is particularly important because one of the impacts of the post-World War II era is that there have been wars, hot wars, cold wars, there have been different kinds of conflicts. But one abiding feature is nation states are trying to increase their gross domestic product. They want to go richer, better, faster. And
Right.
one of the implications of that is they're not thinking about the implications on the natural world, not just other species, but these species are part of a lifescape which supports us. So when we look at floods, you refer to the tsunami, and surely one of the reasons the tsunami has a lot of impact is that people are building permanent structures right near the coast, which historically was never done until the British era. One of the reasons landslides and floods affect people in hill areas more is because there's construction right up to the river's edge. So some degree of ethics and compassion to other living beings, to other ecological systems, and a sense of humility with nature, and replace the idea of conquest with keeping our habitats, our environments livable, safe, productive, habitable for ourselves and other beings. So I think our touchstones have to change. It's a deeper transformation than someone winning an election or a war. I mean, frankly, that's epiphenomenal compared to this very large challenge humanity faces.
But the scary thing is, this would, economically, if rulers or people who lead us would look at it economically and say, no, this doesn't work for us. And that's another dilemma that one is constantly, because these environmental changes are impacting us. But how do we get, I think, the people who lead the way or the people who make the decisions to understand that it's more important to find this balance, and because they're just going to be looking at it from the point of economics.
Sure. So I think, one of the ways in which change comes about is through public debate and discussion. And one of the positive things of Indian democracy in the last 50 odd years, from around the end of the 60s, is that the issue of the environment as a livelihood and rights issue became much more important. And earlier, forest departments felled natural forests which had lots of mixed species and planted monocultures. And by the 80s, they stopped doing it. And the reason was there were very important protests in areas like Jharkhand or in the Garhwal Himalayas and other places, because these forests were important for their diversity, not only intrinsically, but they were also important for livelihoods and cultures. So I think there's a corrective from below, which is important. The other, of course, is there can be a change in consciousness. And I do think that in the late 1960s, we moved out of the shadow of the imperial era. In 1969-70, if you came to Delhi and you were willing to cough up 40,000 rupees, a lot of money at that time, there were shikar companies which would guarantee you a tiger within 10 days. And we moved from that to regarding the tiger as an animal to be protected, not just because the tiger was majestic, but because India had been through 2 severe droughts. There was a new awareness of the significance of forests, grasslands, of uncultivated landscapes, that they were not unproductive and wastelands. So I think there can be change both from below and from above. But, eternal vigilance, statesman once said, is the price of liberty. Eternal vigilance is also the price you pay for ecological security and sanity. And yes, a narrow economic view would not be sufficient. And one needs to go beyond that. And livelihoods of people and the importance of nature in keeping our living spaces safe for ourselves. I emphasize the security, because when you think of the enormous havoc of floods, droughts, of declining groundwater, it should be evident to anyone that this notion of conquest of nature is self-defeating.
Do you believe that Africa, because we speak a lot of Asia and the imperial colonies of Asia, do you believe that Africa has actually been better in finding this balance and, with nature, despite having been an imperial colony as well? Or
it's a very large question. There are 55 countries in Africa, so I'll stick with Eastern Africa.
Okay, stick to Eastern Africa.
In Eastern Africa, one is the population size is very different. The density of humans in Tanzania is, 35 to per kilometer or 40. In India, it's about 400. Much of the land is anyway not cultivable. No, I think those countries had a different issue. The dominance of European powers economically was much more real than in India. India, for a variety of reasons, had a bilingual middle class over 200 years ago. It had an engineering college in the 1790s, got a modern college, the Hindu College of Calcutta in 1817. Much of Africa, I'm sorry to say this and say it publicly, there's a white-black divide very sharply in conservation. Many of these reserves, there's a man, David Western, Kenyan white incidentally, who wrote a book about being director of Kenyan Wildlife Service, and he said he was horrified to find 95% of all visitors to Kenyan game parks were white. And most high school students had never seen a giraffe because they couldn't afford to go into the park. So I think that some of these countries have had a very hard sort of approach to using this nature as a means to raise dollars. But the reverse side, I'd agree with you. I think countries like Kenya, Tanzania have much more inclusive, community-based programs. So if you were to go to the Ngorongoro Crater and watch rhinoceroses, you would stay in a lodge and the money would go directly to the county council. And I do think India has a lot to learn from countries in Eastern Africa or Nepal in community-based conservation, particularly of wildlife. And ours is very much a top-down approach. And I think the forest department, and I'm not singling out the department, that everything it does is not bad, but there is this sort of imperial view that it's my forest, and it's 23% of the area. I think some of those countries, paradoxically, on these matters, we may have something to learn from.
No, I think that what you say about it being a community-based approach is really important, because there is so much divide in India of this is something I need to do, this is something I don't need to do, and you don't realize that it has to be an inclusive approach, from whether you're doing waste management in a proper manner to looking after, to conserving, protection of animals, to domestic animals, to stray animals, to generally conserving water. It has to be a much more inclusive approach, even for a person living in a city versus a person living in a village or living in a forest. It has to be completely different. Is there a common environmental issue that you think all of South Asia faces? And I know I mentioned Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, but in general, is South Asia facing a common environmental issue which is different from the US? And what is your view on this region?
This region is very peculiar. I think we need to acknowledge its environmental issues also depend on its peculiar sociology. Most of the people living here are either self-employed, or they are small producers, or they are wage labor. So when you refer to United States, not even 2% of the labor force depends on agriculture. 85% lives in cities. And up to the 1930s, the US was predominantly a rural society. In the 30s, in the US, there's a huge transformation. There's rural electrification, there's indoor plumbing, there's very good road transport, there's the coming of the motor car. Here we are dealing with a very different situation. We have the largest number of people on earth who are poor by any definition. They live on $1 a day, $2 a day. They're malnourished. You also have at times, particularly over the last 25 years, very rapid rates of economic growth. Where does the environment come in? The forms of economic growth should not increase the burdens on the poor. I give you a very simple example. Across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, groundwater levels are falling. In the late 60s, one major change was the coming of the electric pump. So tube well irrigation became very important. It has powered the green revolution. It has powered double crop agriculture. All of us, wherever we are in South Asia, are drawing on groundwater for drinking also. Let me be blunt. The way we're using the groundwater is if there is no tomorrow. There are various estimates by 2030, 2040, 2050. There won't be water in the ground. It's a common problem.
But that's frightening to just...
It's not rocket science. The other, contrary to what people think, air pollution is a major health hazard in urban India and even in rural India. And in Pakistan and Bangladesh. It's because of the forms of fuel we use, the kind of fuel you use for transport, for irrigation, for agriculture, for factories, or within the home. So I would say clean water and clean air is a common challenge for these countries. Now, I want to emphasize this. The Americans' environmental footprint is vast. For one American, we'll be using many times the energy of a South Asian. So we shouldn't aim to be another America. What we need to do is these standards of living for a bulk of the people have to go up, but they have to go up in a manner that doesn't increase the burdens of the environment. And for the middle class and rich, it's the reverse. It is that our burdens on the environment ought to go down. So we face a fascinating opportunity. I would call it the opportunity of the century. Can you develop in a manner that reinforces the peace with nature? Or does it disturb the peace with nature? There's no
I'm
one
intrigued.
answer.
I'm intrigued that you call it an opportunity and not a problem. I have to say. I mean, because I know that every year around October or prior to October, and you talked of air pollution, and I know being a singer, and I know just being someone who lives in, say, Delhi, we struggle with the air. And every year there are conversations had and task forces put together, but nothing seems to change. And why is that? I mean, what is it that we can do? And yes, we've noticed in the last 2 years of all of us having been locked down for a large portion of the year, the air has been cleaner. And it's one of the things that you can actually step out into your balcony and take a deep breath, because miraculously it's 76, the AQI, versus 999 or something. But surely when you make it sound fairly simple for a layperson, saying that we have to work on the fuel, but is it that simple, Professor? Is it that simple for us to just better fuel? No, I would be, because I know there are many people this would, I'm glad you brought it up, because there are many people who are struggling. I mean, it's like there are all these anti-Diwali firecracker campaigns that happen. There are everybody as a citizen, I have to say large numbers of people are trying, and we are all looking for a solution. So now that you brought it up, I know I'm digressing just a bit, but it would be great to get your viewpoint on this.
No. When I say opportunity, it doesn't mean that the opportunity will be grasped. It means it is there. Let me take refuge behind a very famous, great thinker whom we all respect very much, Albert Einstein, who said you cannot solve new problems with the old way of thinking, because the old way of thinking which created the new problems. So let me put this differently to you. There is a lot of evidence that some say 15, some say 20, some say 25% of the citizens of the national capital region of Delhi are adversely affected by air pollution. And the proportion is the same among children. Now, this is not alone in this part of the world. This will be true of Yogyakarta. It is true of Bangkok. It is true of Mexico. It is true of many countries, and I'm sure you've noted, which are in the developing world. Incidentally, it's true of a lot of Chinese cities. So I think one contrast to the developed and the developing world, in the last 50 years, the developed world has cleaned up its act in urban and rural areas. So if you look at photographs of Los Angeles 1967, they'll be just like Delhi today. I mean, the exact quantum of pollutants may be different. Right. And in the US, had Mr. Trump not been defeated, there was a serious proposal to weaken the Clean Air Act, which was very important in creating the possibilities of cleaner air. So one question is, how important is this to the public? Are each of us treating this at an individual level? I won't go out in the evening. I'll wear an air purifier. I'll wear a mask. I'll run away somewhere at so and so time. And by trying to solve it solely at an individual level, I'm not saying people shouldn't do anything. The scope for collective actions becomes weaker. When you think of collective action, you're thinking of do's and don'ts. So there are going to be costs paid. Who's going to bear the cost? So let me come to something we are all familiar with. And since my university is located in an area famous with it, stubble burning in Haryana, Punjab. Now, the same stubble exists in UP, but the areas of Uttar Pradesh, labor costs are lower, so people cut the stubble. If you were to create incentives for farmers to cut the stubble, if you were to create ways to use the stubble, so Professor Swaminathan, very important in Green Revolution, long ago suggested that the stubble, if mixed with molasses, can be really valuable as cattle feed. You can actually convert it into a commodity, or you can use it. So instead of doing that, there is an attempt to ban it. Now, if you try to ban it, this is a huge number of actors. The very people going there to ban it will probably not be able to enforce it. So I think we need a new way of thinking. And there have been attempts at new ways of thinking. This may surprise you, but the air in Delhi is much cleaner than the air in the areas surrounding Delhi. There's been a flurry of citizen actions, court actions. And the states surrounding Delhi, Haryana, Punjab, UP, always turn around. And I think they're not completely incorrect, saying that our per capita income is so much lower than Delhi's. Why don't you help us with the cleanup? So if we start looking at it as a common problem, which affects all of us, if unequally, which not only each of us does something, but which we do collectively, then you'll start getting spaces. So one point which I'm sure you'll agree is that much of the Western world, not the West Coast of the United States, it's an example of what not to do, has invested enormously in mass transit systems. Mass transit which is subsidized because it reduces pollution, It enables quick movement. It's safer, particularly for
Right.
women, children, and older people. Please look at the amount invested in mass transit in Delhi. And the late Charles Correa once wrote a marvelous panegyric to the men, they were all men, who built the railway of Bombay. And he said these railways are incredible because they define land use across the city by making it so easy for people to move up and down. And he said something more serious. No urban Indian independent state or federal government has built such urban railways. I'm not talking metros, just railways.
Yeah.
So Delhi, for instance, has a ring railway which is underutilized. It could be revitalized. So it will be a number of things that are possible to do, but it requires consistent public pressure. Not only negatively, don't do that, but also positively, let's do this.
Well, also, I
That's not
think
an
great
answer.
governmental action. No, I mean, no, you're right. Public pressure, but governmental action. I mean, from where we are sitting as citizens of the country, we feel not enough is being done by the government. And, if they would only reach out to people like you and other people who could give these suggestions, we could, because it's not a problem that's impossible to solve. You've seen a dirty canal, for example, in Pune, which was converted into this beautiful, it's just fantastic. It's like now this green haven. And if those simple things can happen, instead of covering rainwater canals in Delhi and causing them to become large areas of methane gas producing,
Correct.
possibly places for the breeding of all kinds of diseases and new forms of animals and creatures that could be dangerous, instead of allowing them to oxygenate. I mean, one is surprised that these things happen. And anyway, that's for another conversation. I'm going to let Teji Ahuja ask this question, where he says, would you please comment on the development of canals by the British in Punjab and their effect on the environment and habitation? He says he feels like Punjab is depleting itself.
Okay, one very major impact since the big canal systems were in Pakistani Punjab is that by the 1960s, a lot of the water, they had provided ways to irrigate the land, but they had not provided sufficient drainage for the excess water. So the water seeped down. And when water seeps down, it raises the groundwater level. And a lot of the land gets salinated. So the groundwater has a different mix of salts, acidic and alkaline. These are known as Usar lands. So there were vast Usar lands in West Pakistan as it then was. So when Field Marshal Ayub Khan, he was a dictator, and dictators love to add titles. He was a general, then he declared himself Field Marshal. He met Jack Kennedy. He had two demands. One, I'm sure your guess, was more arms, but the other was assistance with the salt-affected lands of the Punjab. In the Indian Punjab, that is the state of Punjab today, you're absolutely right. One of the major consequences of canal irrigation combined with tube well irrigation is that it has made water very abundant. So a lot of semi-arid areas, which were single-cropped, have become double-cropped. And I'm sure you know that earlier there was a wide variety of varieties of wheat or of other cereals, and a very narrow spectrum of crops began to grow. And I think that's a very major impact in terms of plant diversity. This is true of wheat and rice. It's a global issue, and definitely over the last 50 years, the extinction of these crop varieties is a matter of serious concern, particularly when you're looking at climate change, when you're looking at changing water levels. Some of the locally saltwater resistance crop, brackish water crop could have been very useful. The other impact, and I'm sure you know this, is many parts of Punjab and Haryana have got into what is known as the wheat-rice cycle. The same land is used to grow wheat and then to grow rice. Logically, in this area, people ought not to be growing rice. Now, they are growing rice because they get a very good price for it. It's not fair to tell them not to grow rice. They are economic actors. They are as rational as someone who plays the stock market or, invests in real estate. So one needs a very different agricultural pricing policy, as well as facilitation of alternate crop production patterns. And you're absolutely right on the canals. And the other issue, of course, with canals is their maintenance. As you're aware, a lot of water is lost in evaporation. And it's been suggested, instead of having lined canals, why not pipe the water? That would save water. It may interest you to know, I don't know if you've thought about it. You must have seen, rice, the seedlings are transplanted and they grow in water. And you may have seen very colorful pictures of women planting the seedlings. Firstly, that's very backbreaking labor. It is extremely dangerous. And, that water has ringworms and other issues. But the other point is the main reason that they are grown in water is the water cuts off sunlight and kills the seeds of the weeds. So the water use by agriculture is very large for rice. Rice is the largest cereal in India. More Indians eat bhat than parathas. This may not be popular to say in North India, but it's true, or whatever, Thai sadam. And can we have forms of rice cultivation which are less water intensive? I think it's a very major question. This takes us to another dilemma, which I don't want to get into, which is, should you have GMO rice, which won't need to be protected from these? Well, the suggestion for not depleting groundwater, it is clear not only in Punjab, but in many parts of India, that simply having rules on groundwater use won't work. You need to change the pricing policy, which is very important in crop patterns. If you change the pricing policy, the crop pattern would change. And not only Punjab, I would argue in much of the semi-arid areas, it doesn't make sense to go sugarcane. Sugarcane ideally ought to be grown in the Gangetic Basin, where there is, 150, 200 centimeters water every year. And in the semi-arid areas, it would make sense to grow the various forms of what are known as coarse cereals. It's an awful term, fine cereals and coarse cereals. The coarse cereals are actually more nutritious. It could be ragi, bajra, jowar, kodo, kutki. And that would be remarkably significant. One way to do it would be that in the PDS shops, you supply a large amount of these cereals. The other would be that the elite, who of course patronized polished rice, which incidentally is much worse than rice with the husk. It's less nutritive. It doesn't have vitamin B1 and B2 and all that. That we also begin to rethink our food habits. And I think that this would have a very salutary effect. It is not fair simply to say, oh, the farmer is doing this, they're depleting the groundwater. And I again want to emphasize, groundwater is also being depleted by cities and towns. 35% of Indians live in cities and towns. And in many places, the earlier systems of groundwater recharge have been destroyed. So Bengaluru, great city of lakes, many of the lakes have been filled. They've built stadia and housing societies. Delhi, a number of local water bodies were destroyed. And I think we should rethink this. The earlier patterns of urban or rural development shouldn't be romanticized. However, they were much better at catching and conserving rainwater. So how do we catch and conserve water where it falls? And the very great Indian environmentalist who died tragically in 2004, Anil Agarwal, wrote extensively, beautifully, that wherever you live in South Asia, I'm slightly modifying, is in India, drinking water should not be a problem if you know how to capture and conserve the rainwater. Drinking water, not other things. Drinking water, potable water, you should be able to do. And he did a remarkable job, a book written 26 years ago with Sunita Narayan, Dying Wisdom, and a lot of other works, and tried to promote, small tanks and bunds and various water-saving bodies. And it may interest you to know that the largest number of such tanks were created in the late 90s in one state, Gujarat. There were more built through Shramdan in Gujarat than the rest of India put together. Now, why that is so, I think in Gujarat there's a tradition of collective philanthropy. And it's because of the very particular kinds of cultural expression that exist in that part of India. But your question, therefore, is the depletion of groundwater is about more than the groundwater, and it's about more than the person allegedly depleting groundwater. It comes back to that larger question of, are we thinking about the future? Or are we going to live as if there's no tomorrow?
Yeah, as a collective versus an individual, which is what we're doing right now. Someone, Upin Vasani says, in Southern Africa, culling has been useful.
Yes. So, when you look at South Africa, let me stay with South Africa. It's not very widely known. 70% of all South Africans live in cities. It's a largely urban society. And rural South Africa, I'm sure you know, went through this frightening system known as apartheid, separation. 80% of the land was white-owned. I repeat, 80%. This is not only the farms, but also the wildlife and the game. So what they did was to protect the game. They first exterminated a lot of the animals. A couple of very fascinating species died out. One of them called the quagga. You would love to see it, It was half a horse, half a zebra. Actually, it was a particular kind of zebra, but it was a zebra, half of which didn't have stripes.
Wow, so beautiful.
South Africa has very large area of national parks. It also has a very large area of private parks. It also has a very large area of game ranches. And they have a system, even in the national parks, of counting the animals. So they count how many rhinos there are, zebras there are. When it goes over a certain number, they kill them. And the meat is sold, and the hides or the ivory is also sold. This has led to a major international debate. So, should elephants have a right to life? Do you think a rhino has a right to live with its horn? One answer has been to shoot the rhino with a tranquilizer and take the horn off. Doesn't help. The poachers shoot it anyway because they want other parts of the rhino as well. So this debate, interestingly, India and the South Asian countries, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, have been on the other side. They've argued with the elephant, or for that matter with the tiger, that they don't believe in culling and farming as a means of conservation. They would like preservation or conservation for its own sake. Having said that, perhaps not killing, but certainly removal of certain animals which have become a threat to human lives in particular areas may be unavoidable. So there's a very interesting series of studies on leopards near Bombay, done by a very fine scholar, Dr. Vidya Atreya. You may have heard there's an Indian film heroine who actually does very good Marathi films, which unfortunately the rest of us don't see, Urmila Matondkar. And Urmila Matondkar acted in a film called Ajuba, which is about a panther. And to study how women scientists work, she spent some time with Vidya Atreya. Now, how realistic the film is, I won't comment on. But one of the things she found is that when leopards are captured, let's say on the outskirts of Mumbai, they are a fairly stable population of leopards, and released far away, they come back. So if you put a radio collar, they come back. And rather than that, they suggested they be kept in captivity. So that's culling in a different way, it's not killing. But I think culling in the African sense is not seen as a policy which should be followed in most of India. I think that's not.
Professor, it brings me to a very an ethical question, which is that who are we as humans to decide that a certain life, animal life, is not as valuable as ours? And the same question of how do we, because there are large parts of the earth which are being stressed by a large human population. And in those cases, we won't sort of displace them or put them in another, because we say, gosh, nature can't handle the load of the number of people in this area. Let's move 20% and just, without any choice of theirs, move 20% and rehabilitate them somewhere. Why do we as humans believe it's okay for us to do this? I am constantly, now I'm just talking from a very small point of view, I'm constantly having these conversations with people where they talk of the stray dog population, for example, and they say, oh, we should kill dogs and we should cull this and we should, and I am a little bit appalled at the sense of entitlement we have as human beings, believing that, as you said, we can conquer nature, all the other living beings, and that we are just we are on top of the food chain, therefore we are the rulers of nature, therefore everything is under us. I mean, who gets to decide, and when did we decide that it was okay for us to not live in this sense of harmony, understanding that everyone has their place and everyone is equal, even as a threat? I mean, we're threatened by other human beings as well. We don't cull them. I just want to understand this. I find this a very bizarre, the sense that we say we're just going to kill animals because they're destroying our crops. So to me, it's really appalling. And when this question of culling came up, I was intrigued because I wanted to know what you'd say.
Okay. So let me make a distinction. I think cultivator defending their crops, let us say from elephants or deer, these are men who stay up 90 days, sometimes in pelting rain. And it's literally, their future. And one of the things the Elephant Task Force we did was that our first visit was to an area where people had stopped cultivating the edge of Bandipur. And it was at one level, a difficult meeting. We sat with them and we began by saying to them that, you are the people who grow the food which feeds our families. So we want to know what happened. And they said they have no issues with elephants being in the forest. They would never kill an elephant. They never kill them. They have to chase them away. Now, there's a problem with elephants. They're very clever. So if you use firecrackers, by the second, third time, they will realize the firecracker doesn't hurt them. It may even interest you to know that electrocuted wires don't work because some very clever male elephants have worked out, surprise, surprise, that tusks are non-conductors. They should be students of physics. So that's one part where people are protecting their own life or their livelihood. That's one. But your larger question, I wish I could be as positive. If you look at the 20th century, much of the politics of the 20th century was about us versus them. I always ask my students, what do you think was the percentage of Jews in Nazi Germany? I'm not going to ask you to answer, but the answers range from 10, 20 to 30%. You'll be shocked by the answer. It's 1%. So how do you make 99% scared of the 1%? The answer was, he said, even if they exist, they're a threat. So one of the positive things about the post-World War II world was that it was stated that all people, cultures, races, religions, faiths, and nations have the right to live in security and with dignity. It's not been achieved, but that's accomplished as an aim. The same way that people who look different, speak differently, pray differently, eat differently, are seen as fundamentally a threat simply by their existence is also applied to animals. Now, when you think of Charles Darwin, and it's not a nice thing to say, we're all great admirers of Darwin, so what a great thinker he was. Darwin said, when he saw the Tierra del Fuego islanders, that it's very sad to see them so pathetic, but it's natural that the civilized race will prevail and the less civilized die away. Now, it sounds really shocking. And one of the reasons it sounds shocking is we live in a world where that is objectionable. To be positive, and I want to be positive, the Convention on Biological Diversity signed in 92, including by the United States, which refused to sign other conventions even then, states that the nations of the world should try to protect and preserve all life forms. Now come to your friends, the dogs. It's a remarkable scholar called Mohan Barua, working on animals in cities, Guwahati, London, and Delhi. And I want to postmark this one. And he's studying 3 animals which are very important to the city of Delhi. Monkeys, pigs, dogs, and kites. They exist because of the way people process materials. All of them, their numbers have gone up because of the way people process materials and energy. Now, the pigs, as you know, eat and are eaten. The dogs eat and are feared or petted. The monkeys are worshipped as well as feared. The kites, notice, we have the largest density of birds of prey on earth because of the way meat is processed in them. So the term he uses, I like the term, is not stray dog, it's street dog. This is a dog of the street. Now, this is a problem. If that dog or monkey or pig, not happening with kite, becomes a threat to human being, it's coming to bite you, if it's harming a child, in self-defense, it's one thing. But the reverse of that is you ask why there are so many of them. You do something about that. And one answer would, of course, be that they be spayed, or that they be controlled, or that they be vaccinated. Now, whichever of these you deal with, I come back to that, it needs cooperation of a lot of people. So, this is a very major test, and I think that one of the people who incidentally wrote on dogs attacking people, you'd be surprised, was Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, by the way, supported the killing of rabid stray dogs in self-defense. And he argued that one of the reasons village dogs, he was a bit romantic here, are not feared the way town dogs are. He said because in the village, the sense of community includes the animal. So I don't know if you thought about this. You know, on the one hand, Indians are very cruel to dogs and cats. I am sometimes surprised the way particularly young men and boys behave with them. And they really approach it. But the reverse is interesting. There are so many people who are not at all well off, who give these very interesting names. You know, there'll be a cat living near a flower shop called Billo, or there'll be a dog called Sheru. And this animal is not just an animal. It is a part of the community. So the sense of community can include the animal. But you're right, it can also demonize the animal. So I think the way we deal with animals tells a lot about us. Sometimes the picture is very positive. Sometimes it can be ugly.
Yeah, absolutely right. David Lelyveld says, consider the role of human sprawl in the source of pathogens like COVID-19. That's an interesting question.
Very, very, very distinguished historian and my former senior. David Lelyveld is a very great historian of India. So privileged to have him here. I think there is a long history of pandemics and the origins are debated. And as you know, the Spanish flu originated possibly in one of the US states. But of course, the Americans very powerful. They gave it the name Spanish flu. And we know that the former president of the United States tried to call COVID-19 the China flu. So it's very interesting. So there's a politics being played. So one of the points which I think is worth thinking of is that the human body is also the home of many organisms. So E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, says, and I was quite shocked. Students are always shocked by this. He said there are 14 species of mites, M-I-T-E-S, which live on human eyelashes. It's very scary.
Oh my gosh, that sounds frightening.
But you know, you wouldn't be able to digest the food you eat if not for the bacteria in your stomach. When you eat antibiotics, why does your digestion go? Because it's killing the good bacteria as opposed to the bad ones. Now, COVID-19, a century ago, post the World War I, the so-called Spanish flu, their spread has been enabled by human movement. So consider a very interesting fact. This virus was first detected in China in late 2019. I think the clampdown in China took around 2 to 3 months. I think March or so they clamped down.
Yeah.
In that period, the average people who board a plane every day on Earth is 1 billion. More than 1 billion people get onto or get off a flight every day.
It's crazy.
So this is commerce, it is exchange. We all celebrate the fact people are meeting, there are new transactions, spread of culture, etc. So the same systems which enable our success as a species have created a habitat for this pathogen. I'm not going into whether it originated in a lab or it originated because of wildlife trade. Go back to Ebola. One of the ways Ebola began, and this is reasonably well studied, is that someone went into a forest in one of the West African countries, found a dead chimpanzee. They didn't kill it. They found a dead animal and ate it. And of course, the Ebola virus then made the jump from the chimpanzee's body to the human body and through their feces into the water system. And in the case of Ebola, I think it was controlled because of remarkable international cooperation. There was cooperation between the United States and the West African countries and the WHO. I think with COVID-19, we will all agree that the level of international cooperation, at least in the first half of 2020, was wanting. Human sprawl is, of course, very important. Where there are large numbers of people living densely together, and where it is not possible for them not to live densely together. And you think of South Asia as a part of the world which not only has high densities of people, but Dharavi, which has, we're told, the highest density on earth. Bangladesh has 1,200 people to a square kilometer. So I do think that that has played a very important role. And we need to think very seriously about pandemics as a very major challenge in the modern world. And I do think in the late 20th century, pandemics were taken seriously. There were various warning systems and cooperation, but we'll all agree they were not taken seriously enough.
Not
Around
enough.
10, 12 years ago.
I don't think they're being taken. I mean, even now, whenever the lockdown is lifted and you step out, you notice that people are not wearing masks. I think there's a level of education that's still, of just educating the common man, at least in India, that's still not happening because the masks are worn here or they're being worn here, or they believe that we've conquered COVID and it doesn't exist anymore, or that if you've had it once, you can't have it again. All these misconceptions which need to be cleared. All of the education on the telephones, all the information that's given on those telephone recordings is given in a language which is not the layperson's language. I mean, someone asked me to read something that they had done in Hindi for the masses. And Professor, it was such Shuddha Hindi that I found it hard to understand. And I said, the common vegetable seller is not going to understand. Someone living in Kotla Mubarakpur or in Dharavi is not going to understand because this is not the way they speak to each other. So yes, that's really frightening. I'm trying to see if we have time to just quickly ask you to tell me a little bit about your book, Fencing the Forest, and of course, Nature and Nation, if you could just touch upon them, because it wouldn't feel right if I didn't get you to at least explain to us what you were covering.
Fencing the Forest came out of my PhD thesis, looked at Central India. It looks at trees, people, animals, the late 19th century, and the implications of the takeover of large forest areas, the way it transformed much of that part of the country, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and those transformations remain with us today. Some were positive, many were negative. Nature and Nation is actually a collection of essays, and at the core of it is a question. The nation state often refers to nature to legitimize itself. So the tiger in 1972 was renamed in India. Instead of calling it the Bengal tiger, they decided to call it the Indian tiger. It's supposed to be a symbol of India's unity in diversity. So there were 9 tiger reserves and they were in 8 states. They were very different kinds of habitats. That's the positive part. The flip part is that people who lived within these forests and around them were often not seen as part of the diversity. So conservation, which was good news for the tiger, its prey base, was not very good news for peoples of or around the forest. So I think that one of the dilemmas of environmental intervention is that there are the positive and negative come wrapped up together. One person's dream is another nightmare. And so you come back to this question of how do you ensure material and human dignity for all, and do it in a way which also has spaces for peace with nature. So Nature and Nation then therefore poses the reverse question, that in trying to rescue nature, has the nation state enclosed or perhaps help to destroy it. It's very
Oh,
serious because on the one hand, you say you're preserving nature or conserving nature, but the pattern of development is transforming the world in such a rapid rate that forget nature in terms of animals, birds, plants. The systems that keep the earth habitable for us as humans, those are being endangered. So I look at even the rapidity of the spread of the pandemic or climate change, both as instances of hubris. Not of all people, we shouldn't say all, but certainly that there should be a much greater humility towards natural systems, just as there should be greater dignity for all human beings. Those two ought to go together. So, how do we do that? And I would argue the 21st century challenge of the peace with nature, underpinning the peace among people, doing that. And I think you're right. It is, of course, a great opportunity. But there are very serious signs of major crisis at every level. That's a reality.
I hope that everyone can understand the value of what you've said in terms of understanding the need for peace with nature and understanding the gravity of what the situation we're in and how we need to act on it immediately. But thank you so much for being here with us.
My,
Thank you for being a part of Sunday
my,
Stories Live from the 1947 Partition Archive. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Please consider making a donation of any size because the 1947 Partition Archive relies 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, these donations are tax-free, and the links are in the description to this video. Please tune in next Sunday for another guest. Once again, Professor Rangarajan. It's been so fascinating to speak to you. We've covered so many different topics from partition to COVID. I think that you are such a font of so many interesting bits, so much interesting information. It's really been such a pleasure. I
my,
hope you had a good time. I
thank
hope
you
you enjoyed it.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and see you all next Sunday. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.